We have a remarkable situation surrounding the president having contracted COVID. And I want to talk a little bit about what this actually implies, but I also feel an obligation to be extremely careful in a way that I think is almost not even possible.
Okay.
The problem is, because this issue was so thoroughly politicized, and frankly, it was thoroughly politicized on both sides, but I think Trump was more political about COVID. It is very hard to avoid the Shakespearean narrative that is unfolding, or maybe it's biblical, but the fact of Trump having contracted COVID after having botched the initial reaction to it,
Downplayed its seriousness, all of this. It feels like karma, it feels like comeuppance. Too many.
Let us put it this way. That interpretation, it exists, and it can't be avoided. The problem is there is, and I want to avoid it because at the moment you've got the issue of a human being who has contracted a disease, and gloating over that is unacceptable. But you also have the following thing. You've got, this is the commander-in-chief. This is now a fact of history, and it matters. It matters to all of our well-being. What's more, the fact that the commander-in-chief now has this disease, which we are learning a ton about, but are still new to, that it plays into this election in the final month in this way, sets us up for tremendous vulnerabilities and uncertainty. And we have to talk about them. So the fact that those things intersect with this natural tendency that many are succumbing to Schadenfreude is a problem, because as you talk about what happened and why, you will tread in the same territory that people are experiencing glee. So I want to avoid the glee, but I want to traverse this territory because, frankly, our interests as a nation depend on us doing it well. So I want to point out a couple things. One, the nature of this disease and Trump's parameters going into it spell a very serious situation for us. There's almost no way in which he simply has a low symptom case, emerges from it quickly, and we go back to the election as it was unfolding.
By Trump's parameters, I imagine you mean, what comes to mind immediately are these three things: his age, his sex, and his weight. His size, so by some measures he's obese. He doesn't really look it, but he's got extra body weight, which we know is a risk factor. He's in his 70s, definitely a risk factor, and he's male, which you have worse outcomes in men than women. So all three of those are particular risk factors.
All three of those are particular risk factors, and so I think what we know is that just by age and sex alone, we are at double-digit possibility for death. Right? That's not a huge possibility, but
I don't think that's true.
You don't think that's true?
No. I think the double digit, if you're just looking at age, starts in the 80s.
The 80s, early 80s.
And it actually that's like double or even more what it is in the 70s. And the increased risk of bad outcomes from COVID for men versus women is a couple of percentage points. It's not, and I don't remember it. It's different across different studies, but it might even be as much as like 55-45. But okay. I don't think it's double digits.
At the very least, we are talking about a non-negligible possibility.
Sure.
Much more likely is a severe case. And a severe case could mean all kinds of things that interface with the national interest quite badly. Like he has to go on a respirator, which I believe would require him to be sedated. Effectively, it would put us in the territory where Pence would be acting commander-in-chief.
Right. And this, I believe Boris Johnson was put on a respirator when he contracted COVID 2, 3, 4 months ago. And that was, that was the biggest head of state that had contracted it yet.
And he's quite a bit younger. I was speaking to a Brit this morning, and the fact is it was a month before he was back to anything like normalcy. So my point would be, given Trump's age and other factors, we've got 1 month to the election.
Right.
That is effectively very likely to be completely eaten up by whatever this is. So I guess I would say unlikely that presidential debates can happen, which changes the electoral picture dramatically.
Yep.
We are already in the situation where we are dealing with transparently false medical information or transparently misleading medical information. So
and of course we are. I mean, we would be no matter who he was, actually, right. No matter what party and how beloved or not the candidate was. The advisors closest to him would be putting accurate and complete medical information under lockdown. It just wouldn't be getting out, I don't think.
I agree. And I also think there's something, so many people have talked about the fact that Trump was on stage with Biden. Now, they were quite far apart, but this far apart business doesn't work the way we initially thought it did. So if people have been tracking this, there was initial doubt about aerosolized COVID. So this is a little bit technical, but initially it was thought that the COVID particles were of the nature that they were heavy, and therefore breathed out, they would tend to fall. And that's where the 6-foot spacing idea came from. What we now understand is that this aerosolized transmission happens where these particles effectively hang in the air indefinitely long. They can be there for hours.
It's possible you just misspoke, and I honestly haven't kept track of the distinction between the language. Airborne versus aerosolized.
Yeah, that's the two.
So I thought that you just said both of those were aerosolized. Can we just go back and
I believe
be clear?
Airborne is the larger particles that are affected severely by gravity and therefore short distance. And so
aerosolized is smaller particles which hang for
long periods of time and can therefore go great distances. So
and they are less likely to hang, at least near the person who breathed them out, in a place with excellent ventilation, hence the value of being outside. Because no matter how good your ventilation is inside, it's still an enclosed space. And so whatever was breathed out, unless it's already gone through, the HVAC that has great scrubbers or something, it's still in their room somewhere.
Yep. So there's a question. I don't know that anybody in the public knows the answer to this, but there's a question, I think. So one of the really important stories buried somewhere in this is the fact that the White House could not effectively manage Trump's risk while he was playing games about being brazen and wearing a mask not as frequently as you should, and all these things. You would still think, with all of the availability of testing and the ability to modulate exactly how people meet behind closed doors and all of these things, that the White House would have been in a position to protect the president while playing politics with COVID. And they didn't.
Part of the problem is that we just didn't know enough about how it was transmitted.
That's part of the problem. I think the other problem is they believed their own press, and that there was a culture of bravado that surrounded COVID that began to feel rewarding because they were more liberated to the extent that your enemies are wearing masks and you have your full facial expression. And so there was this culture of callousness and carelessness that ultimately I think does play into why the president and the first lady have gotten sick and why so many people in the White House seem to have gotten sick. And in any case, what will have happened during the debate, right? The debate, they were spaced far apart. That's good. The president and his party were not wearing masks. That's bad, especially since multiple of them were sick. You've got multiple source points.
Yeah, I need to fact check this, but I read that actually no one in the Trump family was in direct contradiction to the rules except for Melania. Apparently Melania was for at least some of that. Now, she wasn't when she walked up on stage at the end, obviously, but that's, good for her if true.
But here's the question. If they thought about COVID as a serious possibility in setting up that debate, then they could have managed airflow to reduce the chances to near zero.
Yes.
I bet they didn't.
Yeah.
Right? I bet they didn't, because I bet other competing concerns like air noise over microphones and things like that would have dominated, and they would have thought, they're far apart, good enough. They don't have COVID. We do a lot of testing, whatever they would have thought. So maybe we find out the answer, maybe we don't. But the question has been raised by many people as to whether or not Biden might have been exposed.
Right.
And, yes, they were far apart. They were also vigorously challenging each other vocally, which is
sometimes looking at each other doing so.
Right.
And that even if it was about airborne only, and that 6 foot thing is a poor approximation under all circumstances, really, because it doesn't account for everything.
Yep.
It's an average, and it only works if you're talking kind of quietly.
Right.
Right. And it may even actually be more accurate if you're just breathing. So as soon as you're talking loudly, or certainly if you're singing or shouting, those droplets are going to be going a lot farther.
Right.
And they were certainly in each other's. They weren't literally in each other's faces, but they were as close as they could have gotten while staying behind their lecterns.
Yeah. And, Biden is notably frail. And so what we have been talking about on...
Yeah, he's got 2 of the 3 risk factors that Trump does. He's not overweight, I don't think.
Right. I think he's physically more frail.
Yeah, so that
not
puts
overweight.
him...
So probably
it's a wash at best.
It's similar.
Yeah.
And so anyway, the possibility exists. But now that Trump has, I think, been forced to admit COVID because it would have been difficult. I've heard people say that maybe this is phony. I think it can't be. I don't think it plays positively for Trump. So I think that's something that had to be acknowledged.
But I mean, it's a hypothesis. Of course, that's a hypothesis on the table. It occurred. I think it occurred to everyone, right? Like it has to.
I think most of us who are paying attention don't trust either of these parties to be honest with us about this, especially.
Okay, how is which party going to play this to a win, right?
Right. But the question is, let's suppose Biden came down with COVID. We now know he's been in the room in the last week with a bunch of people who've had it.
Within, just a little more than 48 hours of someone who, 48 plus hours later, tested positive.
Right.
Yeah.
So there is a question about him coming down with it. If Trump is sidelined from public appearances, i.e. debates, would the Biden camp acknowledge it if it happened? I don't think we know, but I must tell you, I don't trust either of these camps to be straight with us. And the question is, let's be adults about this. The amount that is at stake in an American presidential election is trillions of dollars, right? That means that's the game being played. People who are jockeying for position relative to that massive value that gets controlled in these contests have a huge incentive to do whatever makes it most likely that they will have the influence to peddle and the other side won't.
Yep.
So in any case, I don't know what would happen were Biden to get COVID. But more importantly, the thing I really want to get to is, in light of the symptoms that show up with many cases of COVID, and in particular, these long haul cases of COVID, right? People have brain fog that goes on for months. Right. Some people have things that recur on them monthly. That has implications for the commander in chief. In other words, I think we have to be talking about the question about whether or not is he 74?
The president?
Yeah.
Sounds about right. I'm not sure.
74-year-old man who has COVID in October, right, is in a position going forward. Will we even know if he is in a position, right? Will his doctors know? I don't think they will know. But even if they knew, would we know what the implication was of this diagnosis going forward? This disease is so eclectic with respect to the tissues that it affects. It is so clearly having cognitive implications for people. And we don't know what the long-term prospects are for these long haulers, of which there are many. I mean, the fact is, even in our circle, I know people who have long haul problems with COVID. So, and young people.
Yeah.
So anyway, we have a predicament where we are now, and Americans have this bad tendency to see everything as the sort of internal to America discussion, and to forget the international context where we have antagonists around the globe who, look at the question of how fit our commander-in-chief is likely to be at any given moment.
And
right?
presumably make strategic decisions based on that.
Right. So anyway, I don't know how to have this conversation well, but I do have the feeling that we are not having the proper conversation, which is A, fuck the goddamn duopoly for giving us two fragile candidates at an era where you have COVID circulating and you've got, peril that demands a commander-in-chief who can fire it up at a moment's notice and make good decisions, where we cannot have, people randomly sidelined and, some sort of theater going on where we don't know how sick they are and what condition they're in today. And, the garbage today with the doctors playing games around, well, he's not on oxygen now, right? Not on oxygen now, right? Was he ever on it? Well, he's not on it now. That's not like an answer to the question.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm sure the doctors have been told what they are and aren't allowed to say. So
yeah,
we shouldn't blame them, I expect.
At some level, I'm lowering my threshold of tolerance because the fact is,
yes,
this is bigger than any individual. Right? This is bigger than the election. This is about the republic, and it is these processes in which everybody is policing, their own well-being and adhering to rules that, keep them in positions of power that has put the republic in such a dangerous position. And so my sense is actually, you have an obligation to tell us the truth, because this isn't about President Trump. This is about the republic and whether or not it has a commander-in-chief who's in a position to do his job.